Previously on Catastrophic Failure.
The sole responsibility for that motor vehicle being on the road on Saturday rests with Nauman Hussain.
28-year-old Nauman Hussain was charged with criminally negligent homicide in the deaths of those 20 people. But how much of it was his fault?
I think, frankly, the Department of Transportation in the state of New York is doing a great job of saying, look over there, it's not our fault.
Lee, from the start, blamed the DOT and DMV for not doing their job here. And look, that was a great strategy. And in the end, it turned out to be true.
More details were starting to emerge about the cause of the crash in those early weeks and months. We knew the limo had been ordered off the road 3 times. It was illegally registered with the DMV. It was missing federal safety certifications. Prestige did not have operating authority. And probably the scariest revelation, an inspection flagged defective brakes. Yet somehow, it was still on the road when it crashed October 6, 2018. But the picture wasn't complete. There were still many revelations yet to come about the events and circumstances that led to one of the deadliest ground transportation crashes in decades. I'm Jessica Marshall. This is Catastrophic Failure, Episode 4. It Will Destroy You. If you've been with us thus far, you know that the narrative and the details may be upsetting or disturbing at times, so please listen with care. On April 5th, 2019, almost exactly 6 months after the crash, a grand jury indicted Nauman Hussain on 40 charges. 20 counts of criminally negligent homicide, and 20 counts of second-degree manslaughter. Nauman, who'd turned 29 by this time, again pleaded not guilty. He posted $450,000 bail and went home. The judge, George Bartlett III, set a trial date for September 9th, 11 months after the crash. Nauman Hussain was escorted in and out of court by privately hired bodyguards. His lawyer said he needed them. He claimed that Nauman was getting death threats. The large men in suits and sunglasses shielded Nauman from view as they ushered him to and from expensive SUVs parked at the curb in downtown Schoharie. Later that month, the district attorney filed a 7-page court document. Larry Rulison went through that document with a fine-toothed comb.
It was amazing because it was like the first time you could hear people talking about the incident in the aftermath and beforehand. It was the first time you could imagine Nauman talking to police or Nauman interacting with this DOT investigator. It really gave a lot of context and color that we never previously had.
According to that court document, State Police investigator Erica Hawk called Nauman Hussain 2 hours after the crash on October 6th. Hawk said that she found his number by Googling Prestige Limousine. This conversation is so important, we're going to reenact part of it now using 2 Times Union staffers.
Are you the owner of the limo company?
My father has been out of the country for 6 months, so I'm running the company while he's gone.
So you're running the company?
Yes.
One of your limos has been involved in an accident. Do you know who the driver is and where they were going?
His name is Scott. Is he okay? Is this a prank?
There are two important takeaways from this conversation. One, Nauman Hussain appears to have genuinely been unaware of the crash. The second comes from the next part of the conversation.
Do you know where they were going and who booked the trip?
Let me look. Hang on. It was Axel Steenberg. It was for 16 to 18 people. It was booked last minute over the phone at 9 this morning. They were getting picked up at 19 Pleasant Street in Amsterdam and going to a brewery.
And what time were they supposed to be picked up?
They booked the limo from 1 to 6. They were going to that brewery, and then the guy was going to tell the driver where to stop after that. It was called Omegang in Cooperstown.
How did you contact the driver for the booking?
I called him to see if he could do it. Then everything else was through text.
So Nauman Hussain admitted in this conversation that he was the one who put the limo on the road that day. Not his father, not an employee, Nauman Hussain himself. Around the same time investigators were talking to Hussain after the crash, they were also meeting with the families of the victims. Kevin Cushing lost his 31-year-old son Patrick and his 34-year-old niece Erin McGowan in the crash. He says in those early days, everything the families really wanted to know boiled down to one thing.
How the hell did this happen?
In those early days, they did get some answers.
And the state police kind of took the lead on that. And they were very thorough in, you know how an accident like this could happen. And to a degree, what you could expect would happen inside a limousine without seatbelts at 100 and some odd miles an hour.
Now, here's one of those times when we are going to give you a specific content warning. We're about to go into subject matter that could be very disturbing to listeners. The official cause of death for all 20 victims was blunt force trauma.
I had my doctor read the autopsy report, and she gave me the basics as to what happened to Michael.
That's Mary Ashton, who lost her 34-year-old son, Michael Ukai.
She instructed me to never read the report. She said, Mary, I didn't know your son, but knowing you, reading this, it was hard for me to read it. Don't read this, it will destroy you, is what she said to me.
Kevin Cushing has never read the autopsy report on his son either.
I'm truly glad I didn't read the autopsy. I know some parents felt they needed to, and I understand that as well. It's a level of information that won't do me any good.
And people looked at me and said, how did they all die? Are you kidding me? Did you see that limo?
That's Donna Rivenberg, who lost her 29-year-old daughter, Amanda. She says Amanda was one of the only 2 crash victims who was able to have an open casket.
The funeral director said, someone was with this child. And I said, why would you say that? She said, because she doesn't have a broken bone, not a broken tooth. She said possibly a hairline fracture like above her eye. And she was bruised on her right side. So wherever she was sitting, she kept hitting the person to her right.
And did you want to know what happened to her? Like,
I did and I didn't.
yeah.
I did request the autopsy, but something happened. The ball got dropped, and I haven't received it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still gonna get it, even if just to have.
Yeah.
So Johnny told me that Savannah was badly injured and didn't think we should do any open casket.
This is not the first time Jerry Bersesi has faced this situation. Her brother died in a horrific car crash in the 1970s. At the time, she says, the funeral home made special arrangements for a private viewing that concealed his injuries. She says she found great peace in being able to say goodbye physically, even if she was only able to see and hold his hand. 40 years later, the same funeral home made the same arrangements for her stepdaughter.
He wrecked her head, put some of her hair out, and it was, we were able to get some locks of her hair. So I felt blessed that we had that, because a lot of family members didn't even get to see their children, you know? So we were able to at least hold her hand and touch her arm.
Larry sent one of the autopsy reports to me. It was buried in court filings that he found. I was afraid to read it.
You know, when you hear blunt force trauma, it really sort of paints over what really happened. I don't have any medical training, so there's a lot of words used in those autopsies that I don't understand, but you get the picture of what happened to those kids, and it's a lot more than just getting hit. It's bad.
Every day, I would hover my mouse cursor over the autopsy report file. But I wouldn't click on it. Each time I hovered, I saw flashes of my own family. No one ever discussed the specifics of how our cousin died in that crash in Chicago, at least not in front of me. But she and 6 other people had been crushed under an articulated bus. My imagination has been filling in the unknowns for decades. To this day, I don't know if my great-aunt or uncle ever received or read an autopsy report. They're both now deceased, so I can't ask them. The closest I came to any specifics came from old articles I found in the Chicago Tribune archive. I asked myself over and over, how much more was there to know by opening this autopsy report from the limo crash? Was I really just doing this out of a perverse curiosity, or to see if it would somehow cure me of the horrifying imaginings I'd had about my own family? Was this an unforgivable invasion of privacy against the victim? Did I have any place whatsoever reading this? Or would something in this autopsy report from the limo crash provide critical information? Would it help us break a story that moves the case forward, or understand it better somehow? Is there something in there of value that can help prevent a future tragedy? For me, that seemed like a stretch. But highway safety experts, after all, study how people died in vehicles so that they can prevent people from dying in vehicles. But still, I hovered over the file, at odds with myself. So what was like the Times-Union's stance on how much we talked about the specifics of those reports? Did we have a stance on that, and how did you feel about it?
Just talking to people, and especially lawyers, you know, you would hear rumors or accounts of what people saw. I think there was a real hesitancy to use that graphic description of how the bodies were.
Yeah.
Because it's just, what's the point? It's very painful for even the reader, let alone the families. And I don't think we ever had an official policy, but I think in general, the Times-Union is very cautious with stuff like that. They really have a sensitivity to it. So I don't think we ever got into any real detail.
The Society for Professional Journalists has a series of ethical guidelines that we follow at the Times-Union. One of them is to minimize harm That means everything from not identifying the names of rape victims or people accused of low-level crimes to being judicious about which photos of an accident scene we use in print and online. We cannot eliminate harm when we're reporting stories, but we can, and we do, work to reduce it whenever possible. And that's why we will not be discussing the contents of the autopsy reports on this podcast. Describing it as blunt force trauma, the injury that results when a body collides with a solid object moving at high speed, is as far as we will go. There will still be times, however, when we have to reference graphic elements of the crash, as they were critical parts of the investigation. And again, we will warn you in advance before we go into any of that. We'll be right back.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union subscriber today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
This is catastrophic failure. So as of mid-April of 2019, Nauman Hussain was scheduled for trial the following September. Larry and the Times Union were discovering that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes with the investigation. Actually, to be accurate, there were two investigations. Two very separate investigations. One was that of the state police, working under the direction of Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory. They were investigating the criminal aspects of the crash. The second was that of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Yeah, the entire reason for the NTSB's existence is not to point fingers or lay blame.
That's former NTSB Chairman Robert Sumwalt. He was chairman at the time of the crash.
The agency is really there to figure out what happened for the sole purpose of trying to keep it from happening again.
If you remember from episode 2, Sumwalt was on site in Schoharie 2 days after the crash.
We have shown over the NTSB's history, it has been shown that a judicial investigation and an NTSB investigation can be carried out harmoniously, simultaneously, and successfully.
But in the case of the Schoharie limo crash, there appeared to be anything but harmony between the DA and the NTSB.
It was contentious between the state police and the district attorney. Now, I realize that the DA certainly has the authority and the responsibility to carry out a judicial investigation. But likewise, the NTSB has the statutory authority to investigate in cooperation with the states highway crashes. And here I would say that the cooperation that the NTSB got was frankly not very good at all.
The first sign of tension between the two investigations came about 10 days after the crash. NTSB General Counsel Kathleen Silbaugh sent a letter to Susan Mallory. In the letter, Silbaugh revealed that the DA had asked the NTSB to hold off on its investigation while they waited for a forensic examiner they hired to get to the scene. Once that examiner arrived, she promised, the NTSB could get access to the limo wreckage and they could work in tandem. But when the examiner came, Susan Mallory ordered the state police to forbid NTSB officials from getting within 15 feet of the vehicle.
I mean, the state police are running the whole investigation at that point. under her guidance or leadership, whatever. She's telling them what to do, and they're doing their job. They've impounded the car, they've impounded the other cars that Nauman owned. They're looking after financial documents. They're going after Mavis, trying to learn more. They're learning more from the DOT, DMV. All these things are being investigated from, his arrest onward.
Schoharie County DA Susan Mallory said she was afraid an NTSB investigation would compromise her criminal prosecution. But 2 months passed, and Mallory and the state police continued to bar the NTSB from inspecting the limo directly. The NTSB wrote a second letter to Mallory in December, again asking for cooperation. They reminded her that the NTSB had a congressional mandate to investigate the crash, and for that, they needed access to that limo. They wrote that the delays in access, quote, have denied the NTSB access to the primary essential evidence, resulting in safety-critical evidence being lost, unquote. New York's 2 senators, Democrats Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, both chimed in at this point. They issued a statement asking that the NTSB be allowed access. But Mallory wouldn't budge. She refused to take a meeting with NTSB officials.
The NTSB and the state police have always cooperated in previous investigations in New York when there's been bus crashes. Typically, they hand in hand, very tight. This wasn't the case. From the beginning, Susan Mallory, the district attorney of Schoharie County, was saying she wanted the NTSB not to be anywhere near this case. Very unusual, and I still don't know why she was trying to do that.
The NTSB wasn't the only group growing frustrated with the district attorney over all of this. Kevin Cushing says she was ignoring the limo family's questions about it, too.
That was part of the frustration the parents had, and then when we had our group chats, a lot of people had different ideas of how to shake this loose. And, some people said, well, just leave her alone. She knows what she's doing. She's trying to protect the case. And I'm like, well, others would say, well, the NTSB probably has a better handle on what needs to be done or has to be done partially to help her with her case, or at least get some truth to present in a case, whether it be for the defense or the prosecution. You need to know what happened. Her experts are fine, but the NTSB, they were critical to this whole case, quite frankly. And I think they wanted to do their job, and I don't understand why they weren't allowed to do it on a timely basis. It didn't make any sense to me.
And that is a mystery that has never been solved, right?
Correct. We do not know. I still, to this day, do not know, unless she's just totally clueless about how government works, why you wouldn't let the NTSB help you.
I asked Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory to participate in this podcast. She wrote me a terse email in reply. She would not speak to us. The NTSB never got direct access to the limo. The closest they could ever get was 15 feet. Today, the limo is still garaged at a state police barracks. Despite this major obstacle, Sumwalt says they pushed on with a contingency.
By the time it came to the full board to deliberate, I was quite confident that we had enough to be able to determine the probable cause of the accident, the crash, and make recommendations to hopefully prevent these from happening in the future.
But it would be another year and a half before they would release their findings. With the criminal investigation of Nauman Hussain underway, all of the victims' families filed civil lawsuits against him, as well as his father, Schoharie Hussain, Prestige Limousine, Mavis Discount Tire, and the state of New York. In early April of 2019, just days before Nauman Hussain was charged, the families of 6 of the limo crash victims, the 4 sisters and 2 of their husbands, issued a public statement. The families of Allison King, Amy Steenberg, Abigail Jackson, Mary Dyson, Adam Jackson, and Rob Dyson said they were frustrated by a lack of communication coming from the district attorney regarding the criminal investigation and about what was happening with the NTSB investigation. They asked that they be more involved in the prosecution. Again, at that time, Susan Mallory refused to comment publicly, and the King, Jackson, and Dyson families declined to participate in this podcast. But other family members, like Jill Richardson Perez, who lost her son, 27-year-old Matthew Coons, says they too were frustrated at that point. They felt a little left in the dark, or even forgotten.
We were allowed contact to her, but things got a little uncomfortable. I think there were a few times that I did try to contact her, and it would go to her assistant or her office. It was really hard. That's another person I tried to put myself in her shoes. I mean, God knows that was a really tough case.
Soon after the statement by the Kings, the limo families did get a chance to meet with the DA together. Kevin Cushing says that was when they were notified of the grand jury charges against Nauman Hussain and what they could mean.
Initially, when we met with the district attorney, we were told there were 2 outcomes, charges against him that they thought possibly we could go forward with, and one was 1.5 to 4 years, and the other one was 5 to 15, which every parent thought was woefully not appropriate, and we weren't happy. They said, doesn't matter, it's New York State, this is what we can do. So an expectation was set, and we were, I don't know if the devastated is too strong a word, but we were very disappointed that the loss of 20 lives was going to equal some part of 15 years or whatever.
As time wore on, the questions mounted about Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory. Why wasn't she letting the NTSB help her? Why wasn't she talking to the families or to the media? She was as much of an enigma as the Hussains. Mallory was barely a year into her first term in office when the 2001 Ford Excursion stretch limousine crashed in her county, killing 20 people. The then 50-year-old Republican was the first woman ever elected to the office in the rural county. It's the state's smallest by population. She followed in her father's footsteps. Roger Mallory had been the DA there for 11 years, starting in 1974. Susan Mallory began her law career as a defense attorney. 4 years into that, she joined the Schoharie County DA's office as an assistant DA, where she spent the next 20 years. When she took office as the county's top prosecutor, she had 5 employees total. Only 3 of them were prosecutors. Just for reference, the Manhattan DA's office had 500 prosecutors in 2016, and Albany County had 32. The Times-Union did a profile story on Mallory just after the crash in 2018. She did speak to us at that point. She told us she was accustomed to having a tiny office and limited resources. She said, quote, "Let's just say when you're a district attorney for a small county, it's not a 40-hour work week." Her office had seen a lot of child pornography cases that year, and they had a few stabbings and some paper crime. But they'd never seen anything like this limo crash. The sheer magnitude of the case was unprecedented even for much larger district attorneys' offices. The question quickly became, would her tiny office be able to handle this? Especially considering the fact that Nauman Hussain secured the legal services of Joseph Tacopina. Now, that name may sound familiar. He's a nationally known Manhattan-based criminal defense attorney, and his list of clients included New York Yankees star Alex Rodriguez. By the time the limo crash case reached its legal climax, Tacopina would be busy with another high-profile client you may recognize. He was defending former President Donald Trump in the civil complaint that was brought against him by journalist E. Jean Carroll. The matchup of Mallory and Tacopina was seen by many observers as a country mouse versus a city tomcat. New York State Assemblyman Chris Tague is a Republican representing Schoharie County. He grew up there too.
Listen, I've known the DA since we were kids. She's very, very smart, very intelligent. She's probably really been practicing law since she was about 12 years old, believe it or not. I mean, she didn't have her, she's worked with her father since she was a very little girl, and he was DA when we were kids. She does everything by the book.
Tague says the crash and its aftermath devastated their small community. Everyone felt the weight of the disaster, whether they were first responders, bystanders, residents, or lawmakers. Tague still had trouble holding back tears when we talked to him about it 5 years later.
It's one of those things people for years and years, you always say, don't ever forget what happened on 9/11. Don't ever forget Pearl Harbor. In this small community, it's, don't ever forget the tornado. Don't ever forget the floods. Don't ever forget the pipeline explosion. And it's now don't forget the limo accident. It's one of those moments where you reach over, excuse me, and you hug your kids and you tell them you love them because you never know.
Tague says he knows Mallory had an unimaginable job with the limo case. But even he had questions about what she was doing with this investigation and why.
I was wondering what was going on, and in the position I'm in, I can't call her up and say, what the hell are you doing? You can't do that. And I can tell you right now, ethically, she would hang up on me anyways.
Despite his reservations about what he was seeing unfold with the tension between the NTSB and Mallory, Tague says he ultimately trusted her to do what was right.
She does everything by the book. She's a very good attorney. She takes her oath, and she takes being a member of the bar very, very seriously. It's been her livelihood, forever. So what her thinking was, I honestly don't know.
In the 9 months after the crash, more critical details came to light. Another Times Union reporter, Brendan Lyons, who was working with Larry, finally got confirmation of a toxicology report on the limo driver, Scott Lissanikia.
He had a lot of THC, the main component in cannabis, marijuana, was in his system, although that THC will linger in your cells for a very long time. So it was impossible to know whether or not, he was high during the trip, but after all the investigations came out, they believe he was not, and he didn't have any alcohol in his system.
Larry also managed to get a hold of another driver that Nauman Hussain had used for Prestige.
I think I tracked him down because his name was listed in an insurance policy that I got from the Hussains for the limo, He was listed as one of the drivers.
This driver, James Pachter, testified before a grand jury. He told the grand jury he refused to drive the 2001 Ford Excursion stretch limo for Prestige.
I eventually got on the phone. I talked to him briefly. He was afraid to drive the Excursion. Prestige used 3 or 4 drivers, I've been told. And some of them just would refuse to drive the Excursion because the brakes were so bad that they talked about the pedal going to the floor. Just classic stories of being scared to drive it. I mean, it's a gigantic vehicle. It weighs almost 6 tons and it's got bad brakes. And, you're driving around like teenagers. Of course, that would be a scary scenario. So I'm not surprised this driver refused to drive it. And I know Scott would sometimes refuse to drive it or say you got to fix it, but a lot of times Scott just he needed the money, I think, so he drove it.
And perhaps the biggest revelation yet came in May of 2019. The cause of the crash.
I saw it immediately. I was like, holy cow, this is the biggest story I've had since the indictment.
Nauman Hussain's legal team, which included Lee Kindlin and Joe Tacopina, told media that they had received the Schoharie County DA's final report on the cause of the crash.
I remember just screaming to an editor, I got the cause here, let's go. And we just wrote that up.
Buried in the middle of court filings, there it was, clear as day. A forensic expert hired by the DA had determined the cause of the crash. Catastrophic brake failure.
That was monumental because now we sort of knew what caused it. Because up until then, there were so many rumors and speculation that it was carbon monoxide. There was crazy rumors that the Army had a helicopter and they had orchestrated the whole thing. But we finally got a cause, catastrophic brake failure, and it finally sort of focused our attention on what the heck was wrong with that limo.
With the state's forensic exam complete, the defense got a turn to examine the limo wreckage. They got Hussain's trial date pushed from September to January of 2020 so that they'd have time to examine it. Meanwhile, the DA continued to bar the NTSB from accessing it. Next time on Catastrophic Failure.
Because they were like, you might not survive this surgery. I was so dedicated to this story. I don't care. I'm writing this story. It's the most important thing I've ever done in my life. Why would I stop now?
Catastrophic Failure is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall. Original reporting by Larry Rulison. Editorial direction and fact-checking by Erica Smith and Casey Seiler. Our theme music is Undercurrent by Harper Ray. Special thanks to Kevin O'Toole and Catherine Kiesling for lending their voices.